Hello and welcome to the Ethical Economics Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Brown, the Ethical Economist. Today we're exploring the impact and legacy of E.F. Schumacher and his classic Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered. And my guest today is Jay Tompt, Head of Regenerative Economics at Schumacher College and lecturer in economics at Plymouth University. Jay received a BA in philosophy and then an MBA in the late 1980s before joining a media and advertising agency in Silicon Valley. And for over a decade he advised many of the world's top firms in branding, communications, and even how to get onto the internet for the first time. For the last 20 years he's run businesses and consulting supporting biodegradable, sustainability and community resilience. And today, in addition to his personal responsibilities, he plays an active role in and around his adopted home, the transition town of Totnes in Devon, where he brings deep theoretical understanding with decades of hands-on pragmatism in making businesses and communities better. Now, due to a number of constraints, we had to delay the release of the first recording made in August of last year. And since then, there's been major political changes we wanted to discuss, but also major changes for Schumacher College that we also wanted to include. Consequently, you'll hear the original conversation about the timeless wisdom of Schumacher, followed by an update recorded in the second week of March 2025. Jay, welcome to the podcast.
Very nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Jonathan.
Jay, we're going to get into the ideas of Fritz Schumacher and the book Small is Beautiful. I just wonder if you could introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers.
Sure. At the moment, I'm head of the economics program at Schumacher College. You can probably tell from my accent, I'm not English. Schumacher College is down here in Devon, and I moved here about 14 years ago from California. And I guess what sort of put me on the path that has led to this moment in this podcast begins back in California. I'd studied philosophy and economics and then eventually got a master's degree in international management. Helped my brother start a company in Silicon Valley. Then I started a company in Silicon Valley. This was during the time of the dot-com boom, was becoming just very cynical and unhappy about what was happening. I'd bought into the idealism of that time. There was this moment in California where people thought that the technology of the computer and the networks would herald a new age of democratic vibrancy, of emancipation and liberation, where the world's knowledge would become available to everyone, and that would have a sort of liberatory and liberalizing and maybe utopian effect on society, and that didn't happen. Some of those predictions came true, but what happened was the same old story with regard to the expansion of the capitalist phenomenon. So tech represented really just a new industry and a new arena for those forces. And this is what we saw happening in Silicon Valley in the late 90s, and I was looking for a way out. And a friend of mine pointed out the WTO protests in Seattle in 1999. It became known as the Battle in Seattle. And that kind of just began my journey. I think I was a bit of an activist in college and consider myself an environmentalist and a deep ecologist. I used to carry around a copy of one of Gary Snyder's books in my back pocket during those times. So I wanted to reconnect with that and really just wanted to be a part of the solution. And then my daughter was born in 2000. Bush was appointed president, 9/11, et cetera, et cetera. I just shut my business down and lamented my own choices in life and started getting involved in green and social entrepreneurial projects of various kinds. And did that for a few years until I started a new thing with a company that had been founded by gold miners in the gold rush of 1849. It was a big hardware company that had become a statewide home improvement chain or distribution company. So they hired me and I started a new division for them, selling green products and trying to help locally owned hardware and home improvement stores to transform themselves. And that was a huge education on the effects of our globalizing economic system on local economics. It was also a huge education on products, life cycle analysis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was destroyed in the crash of 08, 09. And that simultaneously was a good time to move here. My partner is English and her dad was nearing 100. So we moved here because we'd heard of Schumacher College and the transition town movement. And we thought if there was a place that would be an easy transition from San Francisco to England, it would be a place like Totnes in Devon. And so we came here, been here ever since, got involved and really started developing some work around local economics, helped develop a sort of a wing of the transition movement called Reconomy, which is all about economic relocalization. And then eventually got this job with Schumacher. I teach economics at Plymouth as well, a similar kind of economics. So that's my story in a nutshell and what led me here. It's not your typical story, but it's my story.
Absolutely fascinating. So there's so many things I want to get into from what you just said. But let's first of all introduce who was E.F. Schumacher and what was the impact on. Let's start off with the question, who was E.F. Schumacher? Because you're working at a college that was founded in his name.
I think he was probably an extremely fascinating guy. I met many people who knew him, and he was well loved by many and hugely influential. I think he also made a big impression on Keynes. So I think he worked with Keynes, if I'm not mistaken, and eventually found his way onto the National Coal Board. And somewhere along the way, became interested in writing. I think in these times, the 60s and 70s especially, the milieu in UK society, in US society, and other industrialized societies was turbulent for many reasons. One of the reasons had to do with the impacts of industrialization and its growth. So the effects were everywhere and easily seen, easily felt. I'm not sure when the last killer smog was in the UK, but air pollution here and in other industrialized countries was horrific. Pollution in the waterways, equally horrific. And then I think, if I remember, he was writing a few essays that caused people like Keynes and others to really encourage him to publish this book, which came to be known as Small is Beautiful. He came into contact with Buddhists in Burma, and I can't remember the years, and he became familiar with some of the work of Gandhi. And that led to his essay, which I think was probably called Buddhist Economics, and this found its way into the book. He was a critic of industrial growth, the kind of industry we had, and then the kind of society that was a result of this way of looking at things. There are so many jumping off points in terms of his critiques and some of the positive proposals in his book.
Let's get into Buddhist economics. I think that's chapter 4. One of the first things he talked about was let me just let's get the quote up and then we can go from there. Is the way in which man sees himself as dominating nature or taking over nature, and the danger in which we have where someone runs a business, a country, in which they confuse capital assets with income. And they run a business by using up the capital resource and treat it as income, which I know that's one of the key things that he starts with in the book, isn't it?
Yeah, the problem of production, I think that first chapter is called, or something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah, that's a key critique about how he saw our society. Depleting these natural resources left and right, spending our capital as if it was income. And I think that critique itself is a sort of launching off point for the development of ecological economics. And again, he was a man of his times, and there was a lot of work in that direction already. I'm not sure if he refers to it as natural capital, but certainly people talk about natural capital in these days, referring to mineral resources and biological resources and so on. And so in that regard, he sounds like an economist. But in some of his other talk, he sounds much more like a deep ecologist and much more attuned to the question of who we are and what is our place in the world. And maybe this comes from his own sort of spiritual intuitions. But this, I think, leads directly to what I think are maybe the most important aspects of his work, which is the focus on wisdom and ethics.
Mm.
So if we begin with those bigger questions, and I think he returns to that again and again in this book, if we have those big questions firmly in mind, then many other things follow, many other insights follow, many other critiques of the current system follow, and suggestions of how we might do things differently. With Buddhist economics, if you understand Buddhism, then first do no harm is one of the key tenets. But also the benefits of right livelihood and working in ways that enhance life, that honor life, that provide meaning, that provide real human connection, and really allow for the whole human being to inhabit one's whole life in that context, I think. This kind of talk is really central to our course, and I would describe our course as being pluralistic. And as a one-year course, we get into lots of different things. But these ideas are foundational for establishing the kind of metaphysics that I think he would approve of, that understand the interconnectedness of all life on this earth, our place in it with respect to all other living things. And the other thinkers that we would bring in to this conversation would be folks like Arnie Ness, Gary Snyder, Herman Daly, a whole raft of thinkers who in the 70s were really developing these ideas and launching other little streams of this movement that we know of as bioregionalism, deep ecology, ecological economics, and so on.
Mm. Mm. I know that the thing that struck me first when I read Small is Beautiful was the point he made that most economists go around thinking that they don't have any presuppositions and that they're dealing with absolutes and certainties. And I was a generation of economists where they really went to town on the maths and to try to turn it into a science, in inverted commas. And there was one right answer rather than saying, well, what are your choices? And I think one of the things that stands out right now with the arrival of the Labour government and some of the statements that Keir Starmer's made very recently is that there's the idea that you don't have choice as a leader of a country is absolute nonsense. The question is, what choices are you making and what's the foundation for those choices? And I know that Schumacher was, when he talked about the Buddhist economics, as you said, if we're doing harm, then what's the impact of that? Why are we accepting that harm is okay? We've got the really nasty type of pollution like microplastics, like the organic chemicals that are permanent. And if they're not, then they're not nuclear. I know he was against nuclear from the waste point of view, but also creating waste that will last for generations. And there's currently no way of getting rid of it. And again, it's bringing in those questions about why are we doing this and saying it's essentially very value-based in his judgment and his decision making. But he was saying the important thing is deciding what decisions we're making must be based upon our values rather than making them blind and pretending that we're not making values-based decisions.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points there. I think in terms of his passion, when you begin learning about these things and you begin thinking about them, you have to become angry.
Mm.
Why have people been allowed to make these decisions around the kind of impacts? I'm trying to avoid using the word externalities because that strips away the injustice of what these kinds of pollutants do to our own health and to the health of ecosystems around us. And I think this is the other big thing that, at least for me, I take away from this book. He anticipates so much of what is now firmly established in the movement for alternatives to the dominant economic paradigm.
Mm.
Whether you're talking about ecological economics or degrowth or donut or what have you, a lot of those movements take as foundational many of the ideas that he developed and others of his time developed around conviviality and having a more ecological worldview and metaphysics. But he doesn't develop it enough, I don't think necessarily. But in order to get to that state of affairs, things have to change. And in the book, he says that we have to take action and that everybody has a role to play. I think the course that, had he lived longer, that he might have promoted was about just that, how we might work together collectively in our communities at the state level to begin to ameliorate these problems, but really going upstream to fix the systemic issues that cause these problems in the first place. Starmer's he's not on that page yet. He may not even be in that book, but at least with Starmer's government and his proposals so far, at least it's a step in the right direction compared to what we had before.
I remain hopeful without evidence, I would say, based on what he's been saying recently. I didn't vote for Starmer. I would much rather have a genuinely socialist government because there needs to be a rebalancing of sorts. I think one of the parts of the genius of Schumacher's work was getting beyond the idea that this pendulum was enough, that the problem was the fundamental assumptions that we're making. And as you said, going upstream to fix the systemic issues. So what would you see as the most important systemic issues that we need to address in our individual behavior, but also campaign for national and international change?
There are many. One of the things that we emphasize in our course, and I think Schumacher anticipates this a little bit, is the fact that our economic system can be seen as a complex adaptive system, and that many of our wicked problems, some people are now calling this complex of problems the polycrisis, however you want to describe it, we have many key crises that we somehow need to solve. They're all somehow interrelated, and many of them have many causes. So I don't think there's one thing necessarily, and I know that there are proposals out there from various quarters about the one thing to fix everything. I'm not sure that's the way it is, but I think
I'm certain that it isn't, right? And if someone, that's a very polite way of saying that, Jay, in a complex adaptive system, there can't be one thing, like by definition.
yeah,
Because
exactly.
and if you focus on one thing, then you're guaranteed to fail because then you'll have all the knock-on effects that you haven't anticipated, and then we'll be in a bigger mess than we were. And I think the stuff that you've talked about and also taking from Schumacher's book is the importance of taking that system. I know in the anniversary edition, there was an introduction from Jonathan Porritt talking about saying Schumacher was one of the first holistic thinkers in this area of bringing together seemingly disparate areas. And for us, Shepheard-Walwyn and ethical economics is the importance of acknowledging your values when you're making a decision and stopping pretending that this isn't nothing to do with me. I'm just making a fortune over here, and I'm sorry that I'm polluting your kids, but that's nothing to do with me because that is, as you described, just an externality of what we're doing. Don't blame the player, blame the game. And actually, the game could be fine, but the rules are all wrong. Right?
Yeah. At the local level, let's say, I think that people and local government leaders, local community leaders can be working toward a more convivial, more resilient state of affairs. And I'm a big fan of little interventions like tool lending libraries, community energy, car sharing, all of those kinds of things begin to make a difference and create alternatives to consumer behavior. I think the lessons drawn from the WPA and I forgot the other acronym, the New Deal, of launching government-funded initiatives for rapid transformation. I think there's opportunity for that kind of thinking. And interestingly, I know Starmer has talked about missions, pulling that, I think, from Mariana Mazzucato's work. And I think that sort of thing to support the rapid transformation of agriculture toward more regenerative models, the transformation of the energy system toward more distributed, decentralized production around wind, solar, and other forms, retrofitting existing buildings. All of these things are opportunities to begin decentralizing economic power, but also shifting the energy regime toward more renewable energies and so on.
Mm.
There are also, I think, another key area would be re-regulating finance and banking, providing alternatives to the maximizing shareholder value ownership structures that we have in the corporate world. There's this B Corp movement, which is getting some traction here and there. So B Corps, as you might already know, offer a kind of certification for companies that are, in short, doing good. There's a raft of 20 or 30 measures that they use to evaluate whether or not companies are able to be certified as a B Corp.
Mm.
And there have been some big companies, I'm not sure P&G, but I think Unilever and some other ones have made some noise in that direction. But I'm trying to remember now, was it, can't remember the name of the company, but very well-known company of that similar stature. The CEO was moving in that direction,
Yep.
who was sacked by the shareholders because he wasn't producing short-term profits. So fixing that, I think, would be another key lever.
Yeah, I go in changing companies and turning them around for a living, and there could be a short-term need for cash flow. The question then is, how can you do that in a way that does not undermine future choices and the right to be able to think long-term? For me, there's no difference between shareholder return and employee well-being or engagement. The issue is around time. There's a massive difference between short-term shareholder return and long-term employee engagement. But actually, if we're able to think long-term about the biggest contribution we can make, both in terms of profits, but also in terms of difference made, then you start to lose a difference between these interests. But it is being willing to think long-term. I know Fritz was very focused on the importance of that the current capitalist approach was immediate return rather than long-term return, and that's only got worse. I mean,
folks in the degrowth movement and some of these other little streams in this wider movement toward a new sort of economics, they do pick this up. And I suppose Ivan Illich and his work was what kind of put this word on the map.
Mm.
And it is slightly anarchistic. It is definitely about distributing the means of production, if you will, into the hands of many, but added a sort of appropriate technology. And in terms of an alternative to consumerism, I think it offers a pathway.
Mm.
But back to your point, the 80s was an interesting time because if the 70s was the flowering of the environmental movement and the kind of thinking that is represented by Schumacher and Illich and other names I mentioned. The 70s was an amazing time in that regard. The 80s was an amazing time for the neoliberal movement and the deregulation of banking, the deregulation of finance and other industries. And that created the stage for the exponential growth of so many of the effects of that kind of deregulation in terms of pollution and so on, and the rapid globalization of this kind of economic system.
Mm.
In a way, this is going to sound really not very imaginative, but in a way, we need to go back to some of the lessons that we learned during the Great Depression and from Keynes, that the market or the government has a role to play in shaping markets. If we want a market to reflect some values, then the national government has the power to shape the market in those directions.
Mm.
If we're in a democracy, then I think this is how we do it. So if there is another thing that we need to fix, is we need to fix our democracy.
It's, as you say, really about the government shapes the market. And I think one of the things that's most evident about the way in which they've done that is with the energy companies and with the water companies. And the issue that we've got, as you just said, we've got to fix democracy. And in my opinion, I'm not putting words into your mouth, but let me know if you agree or not, is the way in which that we've had what for me is very clear agency capture from the companies to the representative of the government, Ofwat and Ofgem, who allow these companies to pollute, to charge more to customers than anywhere else in Europe. And I've yet to figure out why that is, other than agency capture and they're profit maximizing in the short term. The same with the water companies, profit maximizing and damaging, literally pumping detritus and feces into our water courses. And they have shaped our values and they've shaped our society, right? And the problem is our values are purely short-term capitalist. And we haven't learned the lesson from Schumacher saying you got to be clear on your presuppositions because they're the things that shapes most. You've got to be clear on your values because that shapes everything that you do, right?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think in the States we refer to that phenomenon as regulatory capture.
Yes.
It's not so much a capture though when you're invited in. And this is again part of the legacy of the 80s and even the 90s. So New Labor and the New Democrats didn't do the world any favors in that regard.
No.
The other thing I think that is part of the phenomenon, I can't claim to fully understand, the logic and the narrative underpinning the neoliberal regime that has really taken hold over the last 50 years and maybe now is beginning to show signs of weakness, brought with it, I think, a transformation of the social imaginary so that many of the assumptions that the everyday person has about how the world works is informed by this kind of market logic, this kind of individualistic logic that somehow we're all free actors and should be free actors in the economic system, including corporations. And that somehow the market is the mechanism that can solve all of our problems, but also create incredible liberation and wealth. So all of these stories, I think, have become the new common sense. This is why I use this word paradigm.
Hmm.
And so it's led to a kind of political culture, just speaking from my own experience living here and living in the United States, that the political cultures in our countries have become very consumerist and very individualistic, so that people don't really know how to fully inhabit this role of citizen and what that means to be a citizen in a democracy. So if there has been regulatory capture or agency capture or any of these other issues, in a way, and this is going to sound a little bit unfair, but in a way, we get the kind of government we deserve.
No, I think it's the points that Schumacher makes later in the book about the importance of education, both in our society, but also if you're hoping to help someone develop, is it's got to start with education because everything comes from the mind of man, as he called it. And if you're able to control education in such a way that you take away even the idea that you could be a citizen first and a consumer second. I worked with young people in a strange area called esports for a while. And one of the things that absolutely left me amazed was the way in which they saw themselves as consumers. They actually described themselves as consumers. And I remember growing up, I would never have used that language about myself. And even with a degree in economics, I still wouldn't have described myself as a consumer, as a sense of identity. And yet they've actually lost that level of agency or involvement or the idea that this is their society to shape. And that passivity is easily the most dangerous thing, right? In a military sense, if I can take away someone's will to fight, then that's the cheapest victory for me. And if I can take away not just someone's will to fight, but the idea that they ought to consider fighting, that's an even deeper level of victory, right? Because it means I can do all kinds of things to them and they just don't even get it.
Yeah, once again, I agree. And once again, I think Schumacher was fully aware of this and his emphasis on education was apt. Unfortunately, in the last 50 years, we've seen state educational systems here and elsewhere fail to teach the kinds of things that could lead people to become more engaged citizens, but also to be more critical thinkers and to exercise more agency in the world.
And so as an educator then, but also very keen on your experience as a practitioner and a citizen of your adopted hometown and the importance of Totnes in the UK alternative, the transition town as a centre for people doing stuff differently. What what could I do and what could one do in order to educate themselves, in order to become more of a citizen and less of a consumer?
Great question. I think curiosity about the world is, yeah, I don't know how to give you a good answer. So, curiosity, people need to educate themselves. And this is a hard one at the moment because we have so much wisdom at our fingertips. Um, we both are probably of the same age. We had to put in a lot of effort to be able to go to university and to have access to the thinkers, the lecturers, the libraries. Now all of that stuff is online. You can get it in an instant. If you're not careful, though, you can get sucked into the short attention span, dopamine hits of the clickbait and all of this kind of thing. For the curious person, it's all out there. Well, that's one thing. The other thing is having conversations. So if I can't help but think of Plato's cave analogy at the moment, because really, this is how human beings are. I hate to say it. It may be that this is as good as it gets. It's a constant struggle, waking up ourselves and then finding other ways to wake other people up. How this happens is through conversations. As simple as that sounds, conversations are the ingredients of any sort of movement building. And knowing how to have the right conversations, and this is maybe we can reference another Buddhist bit of wisdom here, but having skillful means. So knowing how to have the right kind of conversation, meeting your fellow citizen wherever they might be. And this is something the transition movement has done very well. These conversations can happen in public settings. And this was one of the important insights or observations from de Tocqueville about American democracy, maybe in its heyday, perhaps in the 1830s. The importance of town halls and public spaces for people to be able to gather to discuss the issues of the day. And we don't have those public spaces anymore. And I was blown away, actually, when a friend of mine told me that in the 60s and 70s, there used to be community centers all over the place and neighborhood centers all over the place in the UK,
Yeah.
and that doesn't exist anymore.
I had one on my street, and it was mostly for old people. They went and gathered and stuff, but it was a mixed housing development where on one side there were people who were able to buy a bit of land and build their own house. And on the other side were flats for older people and for pensioners. And so there was that interaction with families on one side and elders on the other. And yeah, there were spaces. So I'm getting some C's in what you're saying, right? There was curiosity, which leads to conversations. And I transferred skillful means into competence. And then you talked about community and having not just having a physical space to gather, but I think for me, the way in which we shape our space and that shape is shaped around us if we're not aware of how that's being shaped. And I think that the idea of you guys of gathering together in a space to have conversation and to discuss how to make things better, I think that's just a wonderful picture for people to have of where do I start, right?
Yeah, there's an old saying, I think, from permaculture, begin where you stand.
Mm.
And that's a good bit of advice. And then one of my favorite quotes from Schumacher is something like an ounce of practice is worth about a ton of theory. And which also leads me to want to quote Rob Hopkins, who was one of the founders of the transition movement, who wrote a book called The Power of Just Doing Stuff. And so the experience that we've had here in Totnes is people doing stuff. And then you see the stuff that has been done. And this has a big effect. I used this word, the social imaginary, earlier. I think people see what's possible based on what they see around them.
Yes.
And so if you, as an activist or somebody wanting to make change, if you can begin to change what people see around them, show them that you can work together in community to make this or that better, that you can make a difference in your town, in your community, in your region, then people begin to see, okay, that somehow in this society where I live, it's possible for me to make a difference, to get involved in this or that, to join together with others to make our lives better in some way. If you look around and you don't see those possibilities, then maybe that idea never occurs to you. In Totnes, we're very lucky. We've been blessed with fertile soil. because of the history of the last 100 years here in this place. Next door is Torbay. It's a coastal city. It's a conurbation, really, of three coastal towns. Some of the worst deprivation in the country. It's the home for right-wing politics, or has been. Slowly, things are beginning to change in this bottom-up sort of way. And for a lot of folks over there, you look around and you go, there's no hope for doing anything different. How would I? Where would I even start? There's no possibility. But then when you start doing things, people see, okay, I can join with these other people who are doing stuff.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things from one of the psychedelic is when someone says, what do I do now? When I become more conscious and more self-aware, then the answer is find the others, right? Because if you're in community, then you can have conversation with others. And even if it's just one other person for you to say, do you know what, mate, I don't feel good about this. I don't like what's happening. What can we do? And to fix problems in front of you. And I love the section, I think it's in the problem of unemployment in India. And he said, there comes a point when you simply need to set to work. In a sense, this is much easier to do now than it's ever been in human history. Why? Because there's so much more knowledge and there are so much better communications and you can tap it all. And he said, we need to recover the common sense view that to work is the most natural thing in the world. And one must not be blocked by being too damn clever about it. We're always having all sorts of clever ideas about optimizing something before it even exists. So I think the stupid man who says something is better than nothing is much more intelligent than the clever chap who will not touch anything unless it's optimal. And I think going back to your comment about complex adaptive systems is you can't understand them unless you engage with them, right? And it's only by small tests that you can find out what works, what doesn't. And it's by running small tests in your environment that you'll find out what works and what doesn't where you are with the resources that you've got. And I think that's some of the criticisms of Schumacher was that he didn't give a route map for fixing everything. And it's the whole point of going small is that's not the point. The point is for people to find solutions locally and then share what they found and then pass it on and move forward. That's one of the things that you guys have been doing in Totnes is having experience and sharing it and getting back to work and testing a theory until it breaks and then going back to say, what have we learned about the theory and also about the practice?
Yeah, I think that's true. That kind of recursive process of learning and learning by doing is an important one. I think even people who are working for alternatives to the status quo can often fall into that same trap of, okay, where's the route map? How do we scale? Let's perfect this idea before we try to implement it. That kind of thinking. I think one of the key learnings that I've gotten from complexity economics is the role of know-how and how important that is for making change in terms of economic systems. And this, I think, could be, I think he hints at it a little bit here and there in the book, but I think that could be a nice pathway for reimagining our educational system and for how we go about trying to shift things on the ground is finding ways of sharing the know-how of how you actually do stuff.
And yeah, definitely. And I think that's is one of the themes that I took with his focus on education, but also about the importance of education, not only teaching know-how, but also teaching why how, I guess, for is okay, what can I do to live a good life? I've just watched my kids make it through formal education years and the disaffection that we had to deal with of learning stuff that I know they're never going to use and they know they're never going to use rather than focusing on how to live and especially how to live today when there's so many wicked problems and so many challenges. When I think for me, increasingly the answer is community, the answer is connection, conversation and curiosity, and to allow my kids now to go, what are you curious about? Follow that. Just find out and make a little bit of money and then get back to it and go forward. I think that you can get very disaffected, can't you, when you start to really understand the scale of the challenge that we've got and that the antidote to that depression and disaffection is action, right? Because then you get the positive feedback, especially when you're working with others who feel and think similarly, share the same values, even if they've got a different view of how to get it done.
And this kind of brings us back to one of his central messages around wisdom and ethics and dealing with the big questions that you've just elaborated on.
Yeah. And there's no economics without values. and values-based choices. And and for me, the problem that we have is the choices that we're making based on the values that predominate in society are ones that are anti-people and anti-human rather than pro-human. Jay, I know we're just running up over time. Is there anything you'd like to say to our listeners just before we close, either about the work that you do or the work of E.F. Schumacher?
I suppose I would say read the book if you haven't read the book, and be curious about his work, but also about the work going on now by lots and lots of folks working for economic change. I would also ask people to check out Schumacher College and support Schumacher College. We're going through some changes now, and we could use all the help we can get.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Jay, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks very much. Jay, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back, Jonathan.
So we recorded a podcast in August on the timeless wisdom of Schumacher and the teachings at Schumacher College. And we've had some delays our side putting it out. There's been so much gone on, both globally, but also specifically for Schumacher College. I just wanted us to do an update to add to that podcast. I just wanted to start wherever you like, what's been going on and what impact you see for sustainable economics and the ideas of Schumacher.
Well, that's a very big question. I can only offer my very humble observations and opinion. Well, I think it's obvious that we're in a period now of big change. Maybe it's paradigm change in terms of how the world is ordered and the ideas that contribute to that order. The conditions that led to him being elected are similar to the conditions that led to the Brexit vote and are similar to the conditions that are leading to right-wing populism all over the place. I think some of it has to do with, in the States anyway, some of it has to do with immiseration generally, but mostly amongst lower income people and so on. And so they have had lingering concerns and lingering grievances that haven't been addressed by the center-left parties in the States. And that has struck a chord with people, not unlike some of the other right-wing figures around the world, that I'm going to come in, I'm going to kick ass, I'm going to take names, I'm going to upset the apple cart, I'm going to throw everything into disarray and start again. So I think there's that kind of energy in the States right now. Of course, he's a clumsy fool, and whatever else you want to say about him, he is being very destructive, making America weaker. So
just as on that, some of the stuff that's coming out with the incompetence and corruption from the government in power, from the Democrats, and whether you look at Biden's extraordinary pardoning of all of his family members and stuff. And I think one of the challenges, the way in which you could resist some of the things that Trump is doing, which I think gets a lot of popular support, right? Clearing out corruption, clearing out inefficiency, clearing out waste, is tremendously supportive. And so it's very difficult for someone to resist that without acknowledging what's gone before, which is, in my opinion, rampant corruption. I'm sympathetic to people saying Trump's corrupt. Okay, but what about Biden? What about all the others? And look at our government, and you can see a slow motion car crash happening in the UK. That if these government parties don't make measures to meet popular concerns that people have got, rather than brandishing anybody as a racist or putting them in prison even, then how can we get to a situation where we have a much more supportive approach to economics, where Schumacher's ideas come into it rather than this brutalized, let's have no government, let's basically get rid of all regulation and then have a free-for-all and let the market decide, which I think we both have profound concerns about. And it's just being able to resist that in a constructive way when all I can see is the Democrats they're destroying themselves in the resistance when they're not acknowledging what's gone on before.
yes, I agree. I think the perception of corruption is much greater than the actual corruption. I think the biggest corruption has to do with the general paradigm within which both parties are working and have been working. So there's money and other factors corrupt the political lenses through which these leaders analyze problems, put forward proposals. Politics is the art of the possible. And sometimes you do what's possible because you think maybe that's going to lead to something that you really want. I think generally what is happening, though, is that the old paradigm seems to be crumbling, and circling around the drain are those center left parties and the far left parties who don't really have anything that is compelling to offer. So the center left parties made a big mistake by embracing neoliberalism. The far left parties, I think you were alluding to a little bit with the sort of wokeism and identity politics. I don't think they have it right either. Starmer, I think what Starmer has right in a way is that he's going to do what the Conservative Party couldn't do because maybe he's a little bit more effective than that lot. But it's not a lot different than what the Conservatives were trying to do. And I think they may circle the drain eventually as well. And so what my friends are really asking is, what might be a third way, or what might be a way for us to ground our analysis and our prescriptions in these times of chaotic change and destructive change and so on. And I think where Schumacher has something to offer and other economic thinkers who are concerned with a sort of post-growth or post-capitalist aspiration will come back to the human scale and the local. If there's common ground between left and right, or at least there's common ground between left-leaning citizens and right-leaning citizens, I think it's going to be found in the local, rebuilding community, rebuilding local and regional economy so that prosperity can be shared across the board, addressing inequality, things like that. So things that maybe the center-left party should have been on a long time ago. I think this is where I'm interested in working. And I think, when I look around at the fellow travelers on this path from degrowth to donut economics and so on, there's a huge emphasis on doing just that, decentralizing economic and political power, and finding ways of addressing the inequalities between, say, the urban and the rural, and so on.
Yeah, when I think about all the ideas that Schumacher had, like even the intermediate technology stuff, so that the technology was able to be used by people without massive capital budgets and it's of a smaller economic means, and the importance of that local connection to the soil and to the community. I think that's the real thing. And also just having very active citizenry. And I think for little people like us, the only hope we've got is for more and more of us to become active in politics, in the small p, and the politics of how do we arrange stuff, the stuff that you've been involved with at Totnes for so long, of the transition town, of how do we create a vibrant community within ourselves, taking into consideration the massive forces that seemingly are at play. Like, for example, the possibility that NATO could collapse is something that I never even would have imagined in my lifetime. And yet we're currently looking at that as a possibility, whether it's some kind of some pantomime around the Ukraine-Russia war, but there's certainly, as you say, massive regime change, but it does come back to what can we do today in our communities in order to improve things, in order to create more sustainable world. And then you got the security measure of, well, if there is going to be more conflict, then what can we do to create local and national food security, which at the moment, given what Starmer and Rachel Reeves are doing on the farmers' inheritance tax and other cuts they've made to the lives of farmers. I don't know if you know that they've stalled or delayed death repayments for environmental projects that farmers have been doing, which doesn't, given that they say they're committed to environmentally sustainable farming, it doesn't. I don't understand why they would do that.
Yeah, this government is maybe better than the last one, but it's still pretty horrible.
What's remarkable is the domination of neoliberal economics and the fact that the Labour Party, if you close your eyes, everything they're saying and doing is conservative. And I'm even hearing rumours now of making benefit cuts.
The calls for austerity don't make any sense. But the neoliberal order, I think we might be seeing the end of it, at least in part, thanks to Trump and maybe some other things out there. That's the really big picture. It could be that this is just one part of the slow motion decline of the West. Who knows what the future holds? But I think it is a huge opportunity. These ruptures, these collapses, these confusing times when it seems all of the common sense of yesterday no longer makes sense, are opportunities to create a new common sense, new opportunities to make sense together, to come back to the things that are important in life, like what is the good life? What is home? What is community? I think these things, as maybe trivial as they might sound, I think are the heart of the new inquiry. At least I think this is something that we're talking about quite a lot at Schumacher College. But I think this is the beginning of a new kind of politics. And in fact, this is how politics used to be practiced before, where politicians would go out into the hinterlands and they would have town hall meetings and speeches, and organizers were in the communities organizing. And I know we've lost a lot of the sort of the infrastructure for that, fewer unions and so on. But I think getting back out into communities and organizing is a big part of hopefully where we might be heading.
I think your questions, the shortness of them, it was very easy to not give them the credit they deserve for the profundity, because they're fundamental questions to why we do anything and why have we got the economic systems that we've got. And if it doesn't improve home, if it doesn't improve community, then what are we doing it for?
Yeah.
More than ever, at the moment where, and then we'll get into just the ideas of Schumacher being almost ignored more than any other time. It's much more important that we get back to the ideas to create local prosperity. And the point you make about politicians getting out to the hinterlands and organizing. I had this revelation a few months ago. I was at the memorial party for a guy called Dave Wetzel, who I co-wrote a book with about land value pricing and the effect of public investment on private land prices. Dave was a lifelong campaigner. He joked that he was so far left on socialism that he made his colleague Ken Livingstone, who ran London, look right wing. That's how left Dave was. So we had profoundly different views on stuff, but there were people there. Dave's bit of a do, I think his wife said to me. And there were some people there, some of whom were very senior Labour politicians from a few years ago. And what was remarkable was how all of them had grown up organising locally. And so they'd started off with problems basically in their street and then in their town and fixed those. And then people tapped them on the shoulder and said, look, mate, you did a really good job there. Have you thought of standing for election for local councillor? And then they do a great job there. And it's, would you come and run the council? And then the next one is, would you stand for MP? And the thing that stood out for me was all those people, the old politicians, and I've spoken to a few conservatives as well, is that they were used to doing small things with volunteers and persuading local people to do stuff, which I think, as we both know, at times it's just absolutely mental and crazy. And how do I persuade these people, this cantankerous old guy that seemingly will not change at all? And you find common ground exactly as you described. And these people came through with that experience. And I looked at the current Labour government and why they're doing so badly in terms of policy choices and things that do not resonate with Labour voters. And I wasn't a Labour voter myself, but I can see that this is not a Labour government. They're not doing what Labour voters wanted them to do. And they're making tone deaf choices. I don't think any of them have any experience of local politics, of local organising and campaigning for change. And I think you can tell in the way that Rachel Reeves writes policy so badly is because she's never done anything to change anything before. And then for me, working in businesses, which is my day job, it's just not the same as local community organising, where you have the closest thing to a genuine democracy that we have in society. And I think what you're saying and how you guys have been working at Schumacher and your work at Totnes and all the community there, I just think it's got so much insight and wisdom for people to consider and to resonate with.
Well, I agree with you about almost everything except the last part. I would be a little humbler. I think we're doing some things that are working. I also work in Torbay, which is a coastal conurbation, has lots of deprivation. And, the things that work in Totnes are much harder to get going over there. And I think there's more to learn about how we, in a way, reinvent society, and also in a way, I think how we reinvent ourselves. Democracy only works when you have people who know how to practice it.
Yeah.
And, generally speaking, the common person, we don't really understand what it means to be a citizen in a democracy.
And the prevailing neoliberal approach is you're not a citizen, you're a consumer, which is complete. And I work with a group of young people, and they actually describe themselves as consumers. And it literally stopped me where I never saw myself as a consumer. I don't know what I saw myself as, but it was it was closer to citizen. If all of us don't get involved with this stuff, then we're all going to suffer because people who don't know what they're doing are going to control things, and we're putting trust in people who really need to have a much shorter leash in terms of what we allow them to do before we challenge them.
Yeah, well, maybe the counter examples that are emerging on the world scene these days will wake a few people up.
People ask me, do you trust Trump? Do you trust Starmer? It's like, no, I don't trust any. And then who do you trust then? So I don't trust any of them. I said, but what I do trust is the increasing number of people who have become, for want of a better word, politicized or activated in the last 5 years of seeing all this wrongness going on, of people in positions of authority making clearly wrong decisions, and they're now challenging. And whilst they were supportive of various people, supportive of the Labour government as potential for change, supportive of Trump, they're already speaking out and saying, this isn't what I voted for. Get back to what you said you were going to do before you got elected, and then follow through on it. The timelessness of Schumacher and the small is beautiful, and that's really where we need to get back to, is the idea that that economies survive and thrive from local businesses, local communities working together and solving problems locally.
Yeah, I think that's part of the mix of the new paradigm that we would advocate. It's a long road, though, and there are many surprises. The human society is a complex adaptive system. Things emerge that you can't anticipate, you can't predict. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union is maybe an example of that. And maybe what we're dealing with now here in the West is a similar shock. I don't know. It's a fun time to be alive.
Do you know, I think there's a Chinese insult of may you live in interesting times.
Right?
If any of us wanted a quiet life and just to mosey on, then that's not going to happen, right? There's just too much going on. So it's time for us to step up and get involved. And as being a massive fan of Schumacher and Schumacher College, one of the biggest changes that's happened since our interview, and the most alarming thing, is temporary end of Schumacher College in a physical form. I just wondered if you'll take us through what's happened to Schumacher since August.
Sure. Well, so I have to go further back, I think, just for a little setup.
Okay.
So Dorothy Elmhurst, well, I can't remember her maiden name, but she married a guy called Leonard Elmhurst. Dorothy was part of an American family that grew quite wealthy during the late 19th century industrialization in the United States. She got involved in some progressive politics. Her first husband died. She met Leonard Elmhurst, an Englishman. Leonard was acquainted with Rabindranath Tagore, and he had been doing some things as a part of a wealthy family in India, part of a Brahmin class, doing some interesting local economic things in surrounding villages and doing some interesting things with education. So he suggested to this couple, you should buy an estate somewhere in Devon and start experimenting in the ways that I'm experimenting. So they did. So Dorothy Elmhurst was, in today's pounds, very close to being a billionaireess. So she had the funds. They bought Darlington Hall and lots of surrounding property, thousands of acres. This particular estate dates back to around the 10th century, more or less. The buildings there that they found date back to about the 12th or 13th century. They renovated them and slowly started putting some of these experiments into play. This is around the late 1920s, early 30s, I think. They started the Darlington Hall Trust, a charitable organization to manage the money and the governance and so on. But it was a family-run kind of charity until they died in the 1960s. But they started an art college that was very important. This is where Lucian Freud went. They started other experiments in education. They did experiments in agriculture and other things. And they patronized the arts in a big way, and architects and so on. Well, then when war broke out in Europe, artists and intellectuals found their way over here. And then in the 50s or late 40s, I guess, the welfare state was conceived there at Darlington Hall. Conferences were held. And so it's really played an interesting role in the 20th century. Schumacher College became a project in the late 80s, early 90s. So Satish Kumar was interested in a certain kind of education, and certainly in preserving the legacy of E.F. Schumacher, who he had become friends with. Schumacher died in, I think, 75, something like that. They started the college, and at the time, one of the trustees of Darlington Hall Trust was the son-in-law of the Elmhursts. Lord Michael Young was a trustee, and a few other interesting folks. So they were very enthusiastic about starting up Schumacher College, and they did. They thought it would be the crown jewel of Darlington Hall, and that it would lead to a kind of resurgence of the estate and Darlington Hall and their work. So that was around 1992 or something like that, when the college first started offering courses. And so the history of that 30 years is that Schumacher College was a project of Darlington Hall. Eventually, the cultures started diverging. And while Schumacher College was gaining an international reputation and bringing in all kinds of really interesting thinkers, I mean, the list is too long to name, but really, really an interesting place that developed ideas around holistic science. In fact, this was James Lovelock's kind of home college. So he worked on Gaia theory there with the late Stephen Harding and Lynn Margulis. Deep ecology found its way into Great Britain and maybe Europe through Schumacher College. Arnie Ness was a big friend of Stephen Harding and taught there. And so the college kept going. Its finances were mingled with Darlington. It was one big organization. So that was probably a strategic error from the beginning. Schumacher College did not pay rent. It was right there on the estate. It didn't pay overheads, but it covered all of its other costs, and that was all it was asked to do. Well, governance is a problem generally, and in this particular organization, the Darlington Hall Trust, I think, the governance problem goes back a ways. So they have almost all the power vested in the chair of the trustees. Time went on from the death of the Elmhursts in the late 60s and early 70s. Eventually, Maurice Ash left, and the composition of the trustees drifted toward privileged acquaintances of this or that character. And so the last CEO and the last chairman, this is going back to the beginning of 2023, badly mismanaged everything. There was a huge hole, millions of pounds deficit. And the new chairman came in, who was a labor peer, and said, there's a financial crisis, but don't worry, I'm going to do everything I can to help. The next thing he did was he brought in his friends from an administrative consultancy.
Insolvency practitioner.
Yeah, exactly. There was no way Darlington was going to go bankrupt because they have millions in land and assets. So why would you bring in an outsider to dispose of your assets when you could do the same thing? But that's not what happened. Instead, they sort of wiped the slate clean. Every project that they were supporting, they just got rid of. And they did it in a very uncaring way. So in terms of Schumacher, we were watching some of this beginning to materialize after the new chairman came in, and we were concerned, well, are we going to be able to run courses? Yes, don't worry, of course. So we were getting ready to run our master's programs in September 2023. Then the chairman said, pause everything. So we had almost 100 students who had shown up for classes, some coming from Australia and all over the world. days away from starting classes, postpone everything. We have to stop everything. What? Where does this come from? That was on a Thursday. At the end of the day, Monday, the CEO, different character, says, unpause everything. Everything's okay. But we're canceling everything else. That, of course, caused some red flags at the Office for Students and other places. And we lost our accreditation because of that, because we were unable to recruit for the other courses that we would have been running or any new courses. Of course, we couldn't cover any of our costs. They eventually said we're going to fulfill our legal obligation to finish the courses that had started. Okay, great. Well, then at the end of August of last year, 2024, they said, nope, everything's closed down. Everybody's being made redundant. And so it's a bit of a shock because we thought we had a little bit more time. Almost the very next day, we started the Satish Kumar Foundation, a new legal entity, and began making plans for saving the college. So where we are now is that we started the Satish Kumar Foundation. They have been in negotiations with Darlington Hall Trust to secure the intellectual property, the name, the library, the archive, and they have supported this process of staying alive. In this process of staying alive, we are writing a new business plan that we will use to assemble the funds necessary to buy a new campus. And we've got our eye on a couple of properties around Devon. We have some very friendly and supportive foundations and philanthropists who are keeping us going and waiting for this business plan and the right moment to launch into action. And then we're continuing to run courses through Schumacher Wild. So we're offering courses in a kind of peripatetic, nomadic fashion. So we've got a core course that we call the new Schumacher Foundation, and we're running that in and around our bioregion at about 5 different locations. And we've got smaller courses that we're going to run in other places around the world, Greece, Netherlands, Japan, for example. And during this time, we've said, gosh, everything's closed down. This is our opportunity to reinvent ourselves. It's an opportunity to be relevant in these times now. We think we might have something to offer, but we're also very humbly going out and saying, well, what should we become? What should we be teaching? What does the world need now to deal with the poly crisis, the meta crisis, the things that are happening right now in the world? So this is where we are. We're kind of at the beginning of that journey. We hope to maybe be moving into a new campus beginning of next year, perhaps, or very shortly thereafter, depending on many different variables.
And so what could our listeners do to help in what you guys are working on?
Well, one easy thing to do would be to join our newsletter and stay informed, to spread the word about our courses on social media, sign up for courses, keep your eyes open for when we launch a fundraising campaign. If anybody out there has £1 million, that would be very welcome, but also we'll be very appreciative of any kind of support, monetary, in kind, what have you. And there's a feeling of inevitability that we will succeed. It feels like what we're doing is kind of noble in a way to keep this institution going. And this process of reinvention has captured the imagination of a lot of our academic friends who are like, wow, what an amazing opportunity. So if anybody wants to be a part of that journey, get in touch, sign up for the newsletter.
Where can we find that?
SchumacherWild.org. You could also find us at satishkumarfoundation.co.uk. It's a little bit complicated because Schumacher College, as a project of Darlington Hall Trust, was not a separate legal entity. So we started Satish Kumar Foundation as a legal entity, and it's now a charity. that could help facilitate this transition. So once we get a few more things in place, we will create a new legal entity that will be the new Schumacher College.
Okay, well, I'll make sure we put the link in the description for people to follow up. Jay, thanks very much for the update. I really appreciate it, and we wish you the very best. From a personal point of view, the importance of Schumacher's ideas have never been greater, in my opinion. So thanks very much, and please keep going.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for having me, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, so to you. Thank you for listening to this podcast. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit our website, www.Shepheard-Walwyn.com, and join our mailing list for news and special offers. Check out our authors and buy the books to learn more. And you can also find us on social media. Links are also on the website. And if you like the podcast, please head over to iTunes or Spotify to give us a review. It's surprisingly helpful in getting the ideas out there. So until next time, keep reading